The storm broke over the hollow with a fury that rattled the shutters and bent the pines along the ridge, sheets of rain hammering the packed earth until the yard ran thick with mud, and Obese Pruitt stood in the middle of it, with her knuckles split open, her black mourning dress torn at the hem and soaked through to the skin, planting herself between three riders and the man lying beaten at her feet. Behind her, Titus rose slowly from the ground, a broken length of iron chain still swinging from one wrist, his eyes fixed on the torches burning against the black Mississippi sky. "If you want to get to her," he said, in a voice that seemed to come up out of the earth itself, "you'll have to go through me first." No one in Briar Hollow had ever seen a bondsman stand between a widow and three armed men, as though she were the most precious thing in the world. But to understand why Titus was willing to die in that rain, you have to go back nearly a year to the courthouse steps where all of it began. Now let me tell you how it all started. Before we go on, if this story pulls you in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. Now let's continue. Obese Pruitt was 41 years old and carried, in the unkind words of the women who gathered outside the general store, enough weight for 2 grown men. She had been widowed 11 months earlier, when her husband Elias, a wheelwright who hauled lumber between Briar Hollow and the county seat, was thrown from his wagon on the river road and broke his neck against a fence post. The men who found him said the mules hadn't even bolted, that Elias had simply pitched forward, as though something had reached up and pulled him down. Briar Hollow sat in the red dirt hill country of northern Mississippi, a scattering of clapboard storefronts and a whitewashed courthouse ringed by cottonland that stretched out flat and endless toward the river bottoms. Beyond the town proper, smoke rose most mornings from the chimneys of a dozen scattered plantations and smaller farms, each marking its edge of the same red earth that seemed, depending on the season, to yield either abundance or ruin with very little warning between the two. In the autumn of 1852, when this story begins, the fields were still thick with the last of the picking season, and the air carried the smell of raw cotton and wood smoke from dawn until the crickets took over the night. The town had never been kind to Obese. Since girlhood, she had carried a body the other women considered a subject for open ridicule, whispered about behind hands at church socials, and openly mocked by children who had learned the cruelty from their own mothers, and her marriage to Elias, arranged hastily by a family that wanted, in her own mother's words, one less mouth under this roof, had never been anything anyone admired. When Elias died without leaving her children or brothers to help work the land, the town seemed almost relieved, as though her grief confirmed some verdict they had been waiting years to pronounce. The loudest voice in pronouncing it belonged to Prudence Gantry, wife of the dry goods merchant, a woman with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, who made it her personal business to remark, loud enough to be heard, on how much weight the poor thing had put on since she'd been left alone, or what sins she must be atoning for to be dealt such a hard hand all at once. Obese had learned in the months since to walk with her chin down past the store window, carrying the invisible weight of a life that seemed to have gotten stuck in the mud after her husband's death. What little remained to her in the world was a modest frame house on the edge of town, a small parcel of bottomland by the creek that Elias had never had time to properly work, a threadbare shawl inherited from her mother, a Bible with a cracked spine, one thin hen that had nearly stopped laying, and $13 wrapped carefully in a cotton handkerchief and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The house had 2 small windows facing the road, shutters that no longer closed quite true, and a chimney that smoked badly whenever the wind blew from the north, small failings Elias had always meant to fix and never found the time for before his accident. $13 that represented months of savings, of eating once a day so she could set coins aside, of mending the same dress over and over, of refusing any expense that was not absolutely necessary to keep from starving. It was on a Thursday court day in Briar Hollow when the town crier, a wiry man named Elam Fitch, who announced news to the beat of a small drum in front of the courthouse, made it known that a coffle of enslaved men would be brought through that same afternoon by a trader named Jedediah Cross, who moved up and down the river counties, selling what remained of a business that by the 1850s ran almost entirely on people bought and sold within the country itself, the international trade having been outlawed decades before. The month since Elias's death had passed for Odessa with an almost unbearable slowness. Each morning she rose before dawn to milk the one thin goat still left to her, hauled water from the creek in 2 clay jugs that left her shoulders aching by midday, and spent her afternoons taking in washing from the more comfortable families in town. Work that earned her barely enough coin to keep from starving outright. The night she spent alone, praying before a small cracked Bible, asking not so much for a better life, something she had long since stopped expecting, as simply for the strength to survive one more day. That year's dry spell had hit the county especially hard, the creek dropping to levels the old-timers could not recall seeing in decades, driving up the price of cornmeal and making Odessa's already thin situation thinner still. It was precisely in the middle of that widespread hardship that the announcement of Cross's arrival came, like some strange and unwelcome promise of change. Odessa had no intention of going anywhere near that auction. What use could a poor solitary widow have for buying another human being when she could barely feed herself? But that afternoon, as she came back from taking in washing at the creek to earn a few extra coins, her apron still damp and her back aching from the work, curiosity, or perhaps a loneliness that ached like a wound that never quite closed, pulled her feet toward the courthouse square where half the town had already gathered. It was there in the crowd that murmured and pointed that she saw him for the first time. He was the tallest man she had ever laid eyes on, with shoulders that looked carved from the same dark stone as the hills, standing in chains on a rough wooden platform alongside 5 other men. His shirt hung open at the collar, revealing scars across one shoulder that spoke of punishments long past, and his eyes, when they finally met hers across the crowded square, held none of the wildness the rumors had promised. The other buyers kept their distance, eyeing him with open suspicion. Word moved through the crowd in whispers that he'd struck an overseer down in the Delta, that he had the temper of a caged animal. Jedediah Cross, a tired-faced trader with rough manners, desperate to be rid of him before moving on to the next county, dropped the price again and again before a crowd that refused to come any closer. $20, Cross shouted, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief, his voice already hoarse from hours of failed bidding under the relentless afternoon sun. No one answered. 15, and I'll be shed of him before dark. An uncomfortable silence spread across the square. Finally, with the weary voice of a man who knows he has lost the hand he's playing, Cross gave the final number. $13. $13. And he's yours, so I can stop losing sleep over him. Among the buyers gathered that afternoon were also several lesser planters from the surrounding county, along with a cloth merchant named Ignatius Fowler, who had ridden in from the county seat, hoping to find cheap labor for his expanding workshop, and 2 women from the nearby Methodist congregation who stood at the edge of the crowd with visibly troubled expressions, unable to do anything but silently witness a trade their own church rarely condemned with any real conviction. Fowler, after eyeing the chained men with open suspicion, ultimately chose not to bid on anyone that day, muttering to an acquaintance that none of them looked biddable enough for shop work. The 2 churchwomen slipped away before the bidding even concluded, unable to watch any further. Odessa felt her heart pound with a force she hadn't known in years. She looked the man in the eye, something none of the other buyers in the square dared to do, preferring to size him up the way one sizes up a beast of burden, and she did not find in his gaze the devil the rumors described. She found exhaustion. She found pain that had built up over months, maybe years, but above all, she found a quiet dignity that no chain had managed to fully break. Without letting herself think twice, she pulled the handkerchief with her last savings from beneath her shawl and walked toward the platform, ignoring the startled looks that began settling on her from every direction. "I'll take him," she said, in a voice that trembled but did not waver. The square fell into a silence that lasted several long seconds before breaking into murmurs and half-hidden laughter. Prudence Gantry, present as always for anything worth gossiping about, clutched a hand to her chest in theatrical shock. "Would you look at that? The fat widow buying herself a dangerous slave. She's lost her mind entirely," she said to whoever would listen. Other townsfolk looked at Odessa with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. convinced she had just made the most absurd decision of an already difficult life. Jedediah Cross, surprised but relieved to finally be free of his problem, took the coins without asking further questions or offering any more explanation about the man he was selling. Within minutes, Odessa Pruitt found herself walking back toward her house at the edge of town, a stranger nearly twice her height, following silently behind her under the orange light of the falling sun, while the curious stares of half of Briar Hollow followed them from doorways and windows. Neither of them spoke a word the entire way, the only sound between them the soft clink of the chain still hanging from his wrists with each step. His name, he told her that same night as she worked the chains loose with a chisel, borrowed hastily from a neighbor's tool shed, the metal links falling one by one into the dirt at his feet, was Titus. The house itself was modest, but kept with what little care Odessa's circumstances allowed. A single main room where she slept, a small storage space, and a lean-to shed out back that Elias had once used to store his wheelwright's tools. It was in that shed, after hurriedly sweeping away months of dust and cobwebs, that Odessa fashioned a place for Titus to rest that first night, laying an old blanket over a heap of clean straw. He did not know a surname. The trader's papers had recorded only a single spare line, the ink already fading against the rough paper. Titus, out of a Carolina estate, age about 26, difficult temperament. That faded line of ink was the entire official record of an entire life before this one. Odessa offered him a plate of beans and a piece of hard cornbread, the only decent food she had in the house that night, setting it down carefully on the small table between them, and he accepted it with a quiet bow of the head that caught her off guard. Titus spoke little, a handful of words picked up over years of forced labor on plantations further south, but there was something in the way he looked, something in how he studied every corner of the modest frame house that spoke more clearly than words ever could. That night, Odessa could not sleep. She lay awake wondering what exactly she had done, whether she had thrown away the only $13 she had in the world on some reckless, senseless impulse that now, in the cold light of night, felt like madness with no remedy. Every creak of the old house seemed louder than usual, every shift of wind through the shutters a fresh cause for worry. But when she rose past midnight and looked through the crack in her window, she saw Titus sitting on the porch step, keeping watch over the property, though no one had asked him to. For the first time in months, she felt that perhaps she was not entirely alone in the world. The first days passed in a mutual wariness. Both tried to hide behind stiff courtesies. The whole town, fed endlessly by Prudence Gantry's commentary, spoke openly of the widow's foolishness in spending her last savings on that dangerous Carolina man. Some neighbors who had at least nodded to her before stopped doing even that, crossing to the far side of the street whenever they saw her coming. Others, crueler still, muttered insults just loud enough to be heard when they saw her walking beside Titus, carrying firewood from the woods or water from the creek. But Titus was nothing like the rumors insisted he was. He worked from the first grey light of morning until the last light faded behind the cotton fields, mending the cracked roof that had leaked rain for months, ploughing the small plot of land Odessa had left untouched since Elias's death, hunting rabbits and squirrels in the nearby woods to add to a diet that had until then been thin and monotonous. He mended the sagging porch step that had threatened to give way for a year, cleared brush from the fence line, and rebuilt the chicken coop so sturdily that Odessa's one remaining hen finally seemed to settle enough to start laying regularly again. And in the evenings, once the labor was done, the two of them would sit together in the yard beneath the stars, and Titus began, slowly, to teach Odessa a handful of words from a language he rarely spoke aloud anymore. Soft words, full of sounds she stumbled over while he smiled, perhaps for the first time since his capture, with something close to real joy, while she, in turn, taught him English with the same patience, pointing at objects, repeating simple phrases, gently correcting his early attempts at conversation. Odessa also began teaching him, beyond mere words, the small customs of daily life in Briar Hollow. Which days the church bell called for Sunday service, how to answer respectfully if Reverend Holt or any white townsman addressed him directly, which wild plants along the creek could season a meal and which could poison a man who mistook one leaf for another. She showed him too how to hold himself in town so as to draw the least possible notice. Eyes lowered, but not cowering, steps unhurried but never idle, the countless small adjustments a black man in that county had to make simply to move through a day without incident. Lessons she delivered gently, but with a seriousness that told him she understood exactly how much depended on his learning them well. Titus absorbed each lesson with a quickness that pleasantly surprised her, applying to this new knowledge the same discipline he had once brought to learning his father's trade as a boy. He built, with stones gathered from the creek bed and an old bellows salvaged from the barn, a rough forge behind the house, and spent whatever hours remained after the fieldwork was done, perfecting small tools he later gave Odessa as quiet gifts: a better balanced kitchen knife, a finer sewing needle, a sturdier hinge for the pantry door that had hung crooked since before Elias's death. Word of his skill traveled slowly at first, carried mostly by Odessa herself when she mentioned it in passing to a neighbor, until old Jonas Pickett became the first in town to bring him an actual piece of broken equipment, a cracked plow blade he had been meaning to replace for a season, more, perhaps, out of curiosity about the man half the town whispered about than any real need for the repair. "Works that iron like it talks back to him," Jonas remarked afterward in the courthouse square, genuinely impressed by what Titus had managed with so little in the way of proper tools. Slowly, other neighbors followed his example, and though their visits remained cautious, full of sideways glances, they represented a first fragile bridge between Titus and a community that had feared him without knowing him at all. She, in turn, showed him where to find the softest cotton for mending, how to read the sky before a storm, and, on the evenings he seemed most burdened by memory, simply sat beside him in a silence that asked nothing of him at all. There were tense moments, too, during that season of mutual adjustment. One night, Odessa found Titus sitting alone in the dark of the yard, his eyes fixed on some point past the tree line, and when she asked what troubled him, he was slow to answer. "Some days I can't call up my father's voice anymore," he admitted finally, in a voice cracked in a way she had not heard from him before. "And then I wonder if one day I'll forget it all, until there's nothing left of who I was before any of this." Odessa, without knowing quite what words to offer, simply sat down beside him in silence, staying there until the first grey light began creeping over the cotton fields. Not everything, either, came easily between them. A few days after the purchase, Odessa had to return to the courthouse square to sell what few eggs her thin hen still managed to lay. It was there that a cluster of young women, daughters of the town's more comfortable merchants, began laughing openly at the sight of her, mocking her walk with exaggerated steps, speaking loudly enough for her to hear that even a runaway slave ended up trapped with the fat widow of this town. One of them, the merchant's own daughter, dropped into a mock curtsy as Odessa passed, drawing giggles from the others that carried clear across the square. Odessa, long used to this particular cruelty since girlhood, lowered her eyes and quickened her pace, feeling the old, familiar burn of shame climbing up her neck. Titus, who had walked with her that morning to help carry the basket, heard every word without saying anything in the moment. But that evening, as they ate in silence, he set his plate aside and spoke with a seriousness Odessa had not yet heard from him. "Where I come from," he said slowly, "a man who mocks another for their body, for their shape, for something they never chose, is considered a man of small spirit, no matter how much wealth he holds. You don't have to lower your eyes for people like that, Odessa. Walk the way the river walks, never stopping for the stones that try to block its path." Those words stayed with Odessa for a long time afterward, and though the town's cruelty did not vanish overnight, she began, little by little, to walk with her back a bit straighter, her gaze a bit steadier, as though the words of a man she barely knew had returned something to her she had believed lost since childhood. It was Titus who discovered, only a few weeks into his time in Briar Hollow, that the true danger facing Odessa did not come from the town that whispered behind her back, but from a far more powerful man, Colonel Ambrose Calloway, the largest landholder in the county, who had for months openly coveted Odessa's small parcel of bottomland for its precious access to the creek, water that could mean the difference between a poor cotton yield and a rich one as he pushed his fields further toward the water each season. Colonel Ambrose Calloway had inherited his plantation from his own father. A hard, ambitious man who had arrived in the county decades before with little more than a handful of borrowed capital and a will to expand it by any means available, methods not always honest, into one of the largest cotton operations in that stretch of the county. Raised from boyhood on the notion that land and power were the only true measures of a man's worth, Calloway had spent his entire adult life acquiring, through purchase, pressure, or outright intimidation, every neighboring parcel he judged useful to his interests, and no one in the region had ever managed to stand against him successfully. Calloway, a man now past 60, his face weathered by decades of sun, his manner shifting easily between calculated courtesy and undisguised cruelty, had tried to buy Odessa's land on at least 3 separate occasions since Elias's death, offering sums so laughably low that she had always refused them, more out of quiet pride than any careful calculation of her own worth. There was, too, that old debt complicating matters further. Elias, in his final year, had borrowed a small sum from Calloway to replace a lame mule, a debt never fully repaid before the accident, which the colonel now held over the widow like a second blade. Calloway's own plantation, called Ridgewater by his father before him, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of the county's richest cotton ground, worked by more than 80 enslaved men, women, and children under Mika's direct supervision. Yet for all his acreage, the creek that cut through Odessa's small parcel remained the one reliable water source close enough to extend his fields southward without the ruinous cost of digging new wells, and that single fact had fixed his attention on her modest bottomland with an intensity that seemed, to anyone who knew him, entirely out of proportion to the little she actually possessed. Without a man in the house to stand against him, Calloway had assumed, with reasonable confidence, that it would be easy enough to pressure Odessa until she finally gave in. Titus's arrival upended those calculations entirely. That woman has no business holding on to that land, hiding behind a slave who most likely doesn't even belong to her free and clear, Calloway remarked to his overseer, a lean, hard-eyed man named Silas Mika, known throughout the county, both for his cruelty and for a loyalty to his employer that bordered on blind devotion. Mika had worked Ridgewater's fields for nearly 15 years, rising from a common hired hand to overseer through a willingness to do whatever the colonel asked without question, a trait Calloway valued above almost any other in the men who served him. Find out everything you can about that purchase. I'd wager there's some irregularity we can put to use. And there precisely lay the true difficulty. Odessa had bought Titus in the informal way common among poorer buyers, without a lawyer drawing proper papers, without recording the sale before the county clerk. A common enough shortcut among those with little money to spare for fees, but one that left Titus's legal standing, and by extension any protection he might offer Odessa, hanging in a dangerous kind of limbo. Mika began visiting town with unusual frequency, asking pointed questions about the widow and her newly purchased bondsman, planting doubts among the townsfolk about the legality of the hurried sale. Some residents of Briar Hollow, subtly pressured, began suggesting aloud that Titus ought to be brought before the county authorities to have his standing properly looked into, a thinly veiled way of hinting that Calloway meant eventually to claim him outright, or worse, to use the whole matter as legal leverage to finally force Odessa off her land by the creek. Briar Hollow itself in those years was little more than a crossroads settlement, a courthouse, a church, a dry goods store, a blacksmith's shed standing empty since the previous smith had died the winter before, and perhaps 24 scattered farms and plantations spreading outward across the Red Hill country toward the river bottoms. Wagons rolled through most heavily on court days and market Thursdays, and the rest of the week the town settled into a slow, watchful quiet, broken mainly by church bells and the distant calls of field hands working the cotton rows from sunup to sundown. Before the trouble with Calloway grew any worse, an incident occurred that would, in the long run, prove decisive for how the town saw Titus. One night under a full moon, a band of strangers, men no one in Briar Hollow recognized, likely drifters up from the river landings, tried to break into the small grain store belonging to an elderly widower named Jonas Pickett, one of Odessa's long-time neighbors. Titus, who slept lightly since his years on the Delta plantations, heard the forced latch and went without hesitation to the neighboring property, armed only with a hand axe. The confrontation was brief. Titus struck down 2 of the intruders before the rest fled into the woods, leaving behind sacks of grain already loaded onto a stolen mule. In the scuffle, one of the fleeing men dropped a battered tin cup, stamped with initials that meant nothing to anyone in Briar Hollow, a small detail the sheriff noted, but could make nothing of at the time. Old Jonas, grateful and still shaking from the fright, told anyone who would listen that the widow's giant had saved his entire year's harvest. The news spread through Briar Hollow with the same speed the rumors against him once had, and for the first time, several townsfolk began looking at Titus not with suspicion, but with a wary kind of gratitude. Even Prudence Gantry, catching wind of the story at the dry goods counter, was heard to admit grudgingly that, well, I suppose even a dangerous man can do one decent thing, which for her passed as high praise indeed. The incident, however, brought an unexpected complication. Days later, cattle began disappearing from the pastures bordering Calloway's plantation, and the colonel wasted no time turning the coincidence to his advantage. Word spread among his hired hands that Titus himself, emboldened by his feat against the intruders, might be stealing livestock at night to sell in neighboring counties. It was Silas Meeker who took it upon himself to spread this version, visiting house after house under the pretense of warning the neighbors about the supposed danger. Titus, indignant at the accusation but wise enough to know that shouting his innocence would only make things worse, chose to act with his mind rather than his anger. He thought back to the tin cup dropped near Jonas Pickett's store and wondered if it belonged to the same men now being blamed elsewhere. For 3 nights running, he kept silent watch, hidden among the tree line, over the paths leading to the affected pastures, until he finally uncovered the truth. It was not him stealing the cattle, but the same drifters who had tried to rob Jonas Pickett's store, who had holed up in an abandoned dugout near the river and continued operating in the area without anyone having yet identified them. With the help of Cato Freeman, an elderly free man of color who lived in a small settlement a half-day's ride from Briar Hollow and whom Titus had come to know through quiet nighttime visits, and 2 other free men from that same settlement, Titus organized a careful ambush. For 3 nights he and his companions had studied the drifters' movements from a distance, noting the hour they usually drove stolen animals back toward their hideout and the narrow game trail they favored to avoid the main road. The capture itself took place on a moonless night, when the 3 men caught the drifters off guard as they drove a fresh haul of stolen cattle toward their hiding place, emerging from the tree line so suddenly that the thieves had no time to reach for the pistols, later found on 2 of them. The confrontation was tense but brief. Badly outnumbered and caught flat-footed, the thieves chose to surrender rather than risk a fight. Titus and his companions delivered them, bound with the same ropes they had used to drive the cattle, to the county sheriff, along with the marked animals themselves as undeniable proof of guilt. Word that Titus himself had solved the mystery of the missing cattle spread through Briar Hollow like wildfire, thoroughly discrediting the rumors Silas Meeker had planted, and leaving Colonel Calloway without a single credible accusation left to hold against him. In the courthouse square that week, more than one farmer who had never spoken a civil word to Titus before stopped him to shake his hand, muttering gruff thanks that seemed to cost them some effort, but were sincere all the same. Before calling a public meeting, Calloway tried one last direct approach. He rode out to Odessa's property himself one morning, accompanied only by Meeker, dressed in his finest coat as though the occasion called for some measure of ceremony, carrying a small purse of coins he offered as one final generous chance for the widow to sell her land without further complications. "Think carefully, ma'am," he said, with a cold courtesy that failed to hide the threat beneath it. A woman alone, with a slave of questionable reputation, doesn't have many good options left in a town like this. I, on the other hand, am offering you a dignified way out. Odessa, with Titus standing quietly behind her, refused the offer without hesitation, her chin lifting despite the tremor she felt in her own hands. "This land belonged to my family before I ever married Elias, and it will stay mine as long as I've got breath left to work it," she answered, with a firmness that surprised even Calloway himself, accustomed as he was to widows folding at the first sign of pressure. The colonel rode off that morning visibly irritated, and it was precisely that wounded pride that pushed him to call a town meeting, hoping to accomplish through public opinion what he had failed to accomplish through a direct offer, and which, should that fail as well, would eventually push him toward the plain violence we already know is coming. Mika began visiting town with growing frequency after that, dropping pointed questions about the widow and her recently purchased bondsman, quietly sowing doubt among the townsfolk about the legality of that hurried sale. Some residents, subtly pressured, began suggesting aloud that Titus ought to be turned over to the authorities to have his papers properly looked into, a barely disguised hint that Calloway meant to eventually claim him outright, or worse, use the whole matter as leverage to finally drive Odessa off her land. Titus, who had survived both the brutal crossing from a Carolina estate as a boy and years of forced labor on Delta plantations before landing in Briar Hollow, was no stranger to this kind of veiled threat. He had watched firsthand how planters bent the law to their own advantage, how the weakest and most vulnerable were stripped systematically of the little they possessed through legal tricks dressed up as formal justice. And he decided, without yet telling Odessa outright, that he would not allow the same thing to happen to the one person who had treated him with something resembling dignity since the day he was torn from his home. Before we continue with what happened next, it's worth pausing a moment to understand the real historical context behind this story. By the 1850s, the domestic slave trade had become the primary engine sustaining slavery in the American South, following the federal ban on the international slave trade in 1808. Traders like the fictional Jedediah Cross in this story were a common and highly visible presence throughout the region, moving coffles of enslaved people over great distances between the Upper South and the expanding cotton frontier of the Deep South, often on foot and under brutal conditions, documented extensively in surviving slave narratives and traders' own business records. Enslaved people were regularly sold, resold, and transported between states, particularly from the Upper South toward the cotton and sugar regions of the Deep South, often through informal transactions between private individuals, especially in cases involving lower sums, much like the sale described in this story. Mississippi's so-called slave codes, tightened considerably in the decades before the Civil War, restricted nearly every aspect of an enslaved person's life, forbidding literacy, requiring written passes for travel beyond an owner's property, and criminalizing gatherings of enslaved people without white supervision. Manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person, had grown extraordinarily difficult across the Deep South by this period. Several states, Mississippi among them, required legislative approval for any act of manumission. Hand-freed individuals were often legally compelled to leave the state entirely within a set period, separating them from family and community. This left informal protections, loyalty, private arrangement, community reputation, as some of the only tools available to enslaved people and to poorer white owners alike, particularly widows without male relatives to assert their claims before more powerful landholders. These documented historical realities, the domestic trade, the tightening slave codes, and the near impossibility of formal freedom, are essential to understanding the narrow and dangerous path Titus and Odessa would now have to walk. Now, let's return to Briar Hollow. Titus began slipping away some nights without telling Odessa where he was headed. She, understandably worried, thought at first that he had finally decided to run, that he had grown tired of a life that, though considerably better than the plantation, remained in the eyes of the law nothing more than bondage dressed up in kindness. More than once she lay awake until his footsteps sounded again on the porch boards, relief and worry tangled together in her chest, until she heard him settle back onto his cot in the lean-to shed. But Titus always returned faithfully before sunrise, bringing back with him information he shared with her little by little, names of free men living in the region, safe paths toward Cato Freeman's settlement, contacts among formerly enslaved people who had managed, through enormous effort, to buy their own freedom or escape successfully northward. "Why are you telling me all this?" Odessa asked him one night, carefully mending a worn shirt by the trembling light of a tallow candle. "Do you mean to leave soon?" She had asked the question lightly, trying to keep her voice from betraying just how much the answer mattered to her. But her hands had gone still over the mending in her lap, waiting. Titus looked at her for a long moment before answering, in an English that had improved considerably over the months they had lived under the same roof. "I could leave tonight if I wanted. No one would catch me in the dark. I know these woods well enough now. But you bought me when no other buyer in that square would so much as look at me straight on. You fed me when you could easily have let me starve without anyone blaming you for it. I don't intend to leave you alone against that colonel." Titus's words moved Odessa deeply. She who had spent her whole life treated as an unwanted burden, first by her own family, who had married her off hastily to Elias to, in their own cruel words, get her off their hands, then by the whole town, which saw her openly as a useless, inconvenient weight after her husband's death. For the first time in years, someone was choosing, of their own free will, to stay by her side. Not out of obligation, not out of calculated convenience, but by genuine choice. It was during this same period of growing closeness that an episode occurred which would seal the trust between them completely. Odessa fell dangerously ill with fever during a spell of autumn rains, a sickness that swept through the low county most years and claimed the old and the young alike, and for 3 days lay confined to her bed, delirious and soaked in cold sweat, murmuring fragments of prayers and half-remembered hymns that made no sense strung together. The rain drummed steadily on the roof throughout, as though the storm itself refused to let up until her fever finally broke. Titus, knowing little of medicine beyond a handful of remedies remembered from childhood, refused to leave her side for even a moment, laying cool cloths on her forehead and coaxing her with endless patience to take small sips of water each time the fever threatened to take her under entirely. It was Titus, too, desperate when her fever showed no sign of breaking by the 3rd night, who walked at night to the home of an elderly herbalist on the far edge of town, a suspicious old man who at first refused to treat the widow on account of that dangerous slave keeping her company, bolting his door and refusing to so much as open a window. Titus knocked steadily for the better part of an hour, his voice growing hoarse with pleading, before the old man finally stirred behind the bolted door. Only when Titus, with visible tears, knelt outside that door and begged him with everything he had, did the old man finally relent, grudgingly agreeing to prepare a bitter tea of roots and bark that helped Odessa's fever finally break on the 4th day. When Odessa woke fully lucid for the first time since falling ill, she found Titus asleep sitting beside her bed, his face gaunt from lack of sleep, a damp cloth still clutched in one hand. She lay still for several long minutes, unwilling yet to break the quiet. It was in that exact moment, watching the plain exhaustion of a man she had known only a few months, that Odessa understood with total clarity that what she felt for Titus was no longer simple gratitude for his protection, but something far deeper that she still did not dare to name aloud. She reached out, careful not to wake him just yet, and simply watched the slow rise and fall of his breathing for a long while, before finally speaking his name. The tension with Colonel Calloway grew steadily worse over the following weeks. Silas Meeker began patrolling the edges of Odessa's property with growing boldness, sometimes accompanied by other armed men on horseback, always under the convenient excuse of checking the property lines of the neighboring plantation, though everyone in town knew perfectly well it was nothing but calculated intimidation. One hot afternoon, while Titus was mending the split-rail fence around the small corral, sweat soaking through his shirt in the heavy midday heat, Meeker rode up flanked by 2 more men, all of them carrying visibly sharpened blades. "Tell your mistress," he sneered, deliberately choosing a word he knew Titus despised, "that the colonel's making her one last generous offer for this land. After this offer there won't be any more kind words, only trouble." Titus said nothing in reply. He simply held Meeker's challenging stare for several uncomfortable seconds until the overseer, visibly unsettled by that silent steadiness, finally chose to ride off with his men, not before spitting on the ground in a calculated show of contempt. But the message had landed clearly enough for both of them. Calloway's patience was running out fast. Odessa, hearing of the threat that same night, wanted to give in at once, the old fear of losing everything rising in her chest, the way it had in the months right after Elias's death. "Maybe we ought to just sell the land," she told Titus that night, silent tears running down her cheeks. I don't want you hurt on my account. I don't want anyone else suffering trying to protect me." It was precisely then that Titus decided to tell her, for the first time in full, the whole story of his life before he was brought to Mississippi. He had never spoken so openly to anyone since his capture, and the words seemed to come slowly at first, as though each one had to be pried loose from some deep, guarded place before it could be spoken aloud. He had been born, he told her, on an estate in the Carolina backcountry, the eldest son of a blacksmith well respected within the small community of enslaved families there, a man whose forge had been the gathering place for half the plantation on quiet evenings, where stories and songs passed as freely as the tools he mended. From childhood he had learned not only the trade of working iron alongside his father, but also, in secret, a handful of the fighting skills passed quietly down among the older men on the estate, learned in stolen hours after dark, taught by an old man who had himself once been a warrior before ever being carried across the sea as a much younger man. He had been sold south as a young man, after his father's death, to settle a debt of the estate's owner, torn from every person and place he had ever known, and marched in a coffle down through Georgia toward the cotton lands of the deep interior. The march itself had taken the better part of 3 weeks, the coffle driven along in the worst heat of late summer, fed barely enough to keep them walking, and watered only when the traders judged it necessary to protect their investment rather than out of any mercy. Titus remembered the particular ache of iron shackles rubbing his ankles raw within the first days, an ache that never fully left him even years later on quiet nights, and the strange, hollow silence that fell over the group each evening when the traders counted heads by torchlight, as though tallying livestock rather than people. In the cotton country, he had first been sold to a plantation where conditions were so brutal that several young men chose to risk running rather than endure it, driven out at first light, and worked until well past dark under an overseer, known even among neighboring plantations for his particular cruelty, fully aware that death in freedom was infinitely preferable to a lifetime under such torment. Titus had tried to run once himself, had been caught after several days of pursuit, and as punishment had been branded and sold again, this time to Jedediah Cross, who from then on dragged him from county to county, trying without success to be rid of him, given the growing reputation for being a difficult man that both his visible scars and his unflinching gaze projected onto any potential buyer. He told her, too, with a voice broken by a pain that seemed to have lessened not at all with the passing years, the details of that forced march down through the Carolinas and Georgia that had separated him forever from everything and everyone he had ever known. He remembered the iron coffle chain biting into his wrists day after day, the dust of unpaved roads coating his throat until he could no longer taste anything else, the traders who counted heads each morning the way a farmer counts livestock before setting out. He remembered men and women he recognized from childhood, on the estate falling sick and dying along the roadside, buried in shallow unmarked graves without ceremony of any kind, while the coffle was made to keep walking within the hour, as though nothing at all had happened. There had been one man in particular, an old preacher on the estate named Amos Coker, who during the first days of the forced march kept singing low, steady hymns to keep the younger men's spirits from breaking, his voice carrying just above a whisper, so the traders riding alongside would not silence him outright. Titus remembered how Amos had pressed a hand to his shoulder one night and told him, in words he still repeated to himself in the darkest hours, that a man can be sold 100 times over, and they still never own the part of him that decides who he's going to be. Sickness and hunger finally silenced the old preacher for good before they ever reached the cotton counties, and Titus had carried both his words and his absence with him ever since. Titus confessed that for years he had carried a quiet guilt for having survived when so many others, the old preacher among them, had not, a guilt that had only begun to ease since he found, in Odessa's small frame house, something resembling a new purpose. "No one had ever looked at me the way you looked at me that day in the square," he confessed finally to Odessa, with a vulnerability she had never before witnessed in him, his voice barely above a whisper in the candle-lit room. "Everyone else saw only danger, or at best damaged goods not worth the trouble. You instead simply saw a man who was deeply tired. For that reason alone, I don't intend to let you lose the one thing of true value you still have left in this world." The next day, Titus made a decision. He traveled by night to Cato Freeman's settlement, where he found the old man and laid out plainly the full weight of the danger closing in around Odessa, watching Cato's weathered face carefully for any sign of the answer before he even finished speaking. Cato Freeman had lived free for nearly 30 years, having purchased his own liberty as a young man through decades of hired-out blacksmith work, saving every spare coin until he could finally buy himself from a Carolina owner, grown old and eager for cash. He had since settled with a handful of other free families in a small cluster of cabins tucked against the base of a ridge, a half-day's ride from Briar Hollow, a settlement that existed always under careful, watchful compromise with the surrounding white landowners who tolerated its presence only so long as it caused no trouble and drew no attention. Cato, who had spent decades learning to read the narrow and dangerous paths available to free and enslaved people alike under Mississippi law, thought for a long while before speaking. "There's no court in this state that'll grant you your freedom outright, son. Not with the laws as they stand now," he said gently, resting a weathered hand briefly on Titus's shoulder. "But there's a way to make sure that woman's claim on you can't be picked apart by a man like Calloway. Get her to have the sale written up proper, before a magistrate, plain and legal, with witnesses to it. It won't make you a free man, but it'll make you hers, beyond any question, and that may be protection enough for what's coming." It was a risky plan all the same. It required traveling to the county seat, presenting themselves before a magistrate, who could easily be swayed by a man of Calloway's standing, and hoping the paperwork could be properly filed before the colonel resorted to more drastic measures. Every mile of the road there would carry its own danger for a black man traveling without clear papers already in hand, but it represented the only path available to them that did not depend on outright violence or a desperate flight into the woods. Titus returned to Briar Hollow just before dawn and told Odessa everything Cato Freeman had said. She accepted without a moment's hesitation. "I never once thought of you as property, not from that very first day," she told him, taking his calloused hands in hers, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "If putting my name to a paper before a magistrate is what keeps you safe from that man, then I'll sign it gladly, without a second thought." They traveled to the county seat 2 days later, careful to time their trip, while Mika was occupied overseeing the harvest on Calloway's land. They set out before first light, carrying only a heel of hard bread and water in a gourd, deliberately avoiding the main road for fear of crossing paths with any of Calloway's men. The road proved harder than either had expected. A sudden storm caught them at midday, forcing them to shelter for hours beneath a rocky overhang near the creek, where they sat listening to the rush of water while sharing what little bread they had brought. Twice along the back roads, they thought they glimpsed riders in the distance who might easily have belonged to Mika, forcing them to veer off onto narrower, longer paths through low ground where the mud pulled at their boots with every step. It was during that forced wait beneath the overhang, huddled close beneath the rain, that Titus, perhaps feeling more exposed than usual, asked Odessa if she was afraid of what might happen should the magistrate refuse to side with them. She looked at him steadily despite the grey light and answered without hesitation, "I'm more afraid of a life without you beside me than I am of any magistrate who might rule against you." It was perhaps in that exact moment beneath the storm that both of them understood, without saying so aloud, that what bound them together was no longer simple gratitude. They spent that night at a modest roadside inn on the outskirts of the county seat, where the innkeeper, a quiet man named Willis Hobbs, looked them over once with an unreadable expression, but asked no questions about why a widow traveled with a bondsman toward the courthouse, and simply pointed them toward a corner of the stable for the night in exchange for a coin. Odessa hardly slept, turning over in her mind again and again the words she meant to say before the magistrate, while Titus kept watch near the stable door, just as he had every night since the first he'd spent under her roof. At the county courthouse, the widow and her bondsman found themselves before a magistrate named Ezekiel Vance, an older man with tired but fair eyes, who, though visibly startled by the unusual sight of a poor widow taking such trouble over a formal witnessed sale, proceeded with the matter strictly according to the law, finding nothing in it that ran against the county's requirements. He called in his clerk, a thin young man who copied out the bill of sale in careful, even script, while Obese and Titus stood waiting in tense silence, and had 2 passing merchants from the square sign as witnesses before the ink had even fully dried. The bill of sale was drawn up, signed, witnessed, and properly recorded among the county's records. It was not freedom, but it was, at last, a claim that no man in the county could quietly dispute. Barely 2 weeks after that record was entered, a complication arrived that neither Titus nor Obese had anticipated. A hard-faced man named Rufus Tanner, who made his living tracking down runaways for planters across 3 counties, rode into Briar Hollow on a lathered horse, dust caked thick on his boots from what had clearly been a long ride, asking after a large Carolina-born man, marked on the left shoulder, last held on an estate near the Georgia line. Tanner presented himself as a lawfully hired agent, sent by the original Carolina estate to recover property he claimed had escaped before ever being legally sold south at all, which, if true, would mean Jedediah Cross had never held clear title to sell Titus to anyone, Obese included. The news struck the small household like a blow. Titus, who knew the full truth of what had happened on that Carolina estate, explained to Obese with forced calm that he had indeed tried to run once, years before, but had been caught, punished, and afterwards sold off legally by the estate's own owner, who had grown weary of his repeated attempts at escape and wanted him gone for good. That sale, Titus insisted, had been properly settled. A receipt had changed hands with Cross at the time, plain and simple. The trouble was that Jedediah Cross had long since moved on from Briar Hollow, continuing his circuit through other counties, and no one could say with any certainty where to find him to confirm the existence of that old receipt. Without it, Titus's word alone, set against a hired agent backed by a Carolina planter of some standing, risked carrying no legal weight at all before a court. It was Cato Freeman who once again offered a way forward. He recalled that Cross was known to pass through the trading post at Cypress Landing, most autumns, to restock supplies and settle accounts before the season's end, and he suggested it was worth the risk of finding him there before Tanner's claim could gain any further ground with the county authorities. Titus, accompanied this time by Cato himself, set out on the 2-day ride to Cypress Landing. The road proved tense from the start. On the 2nd day, cutting through a stretch of pine woods known for the occasional patrol of armed men, checking papers on any black traveler they came across, Titus and Cato were stopped by 3 such men who, seeing a large black man traveling without a white escort, moved at once to detain them as suspected runaways. One of the men, younger and more eager than the rest, leveled a shotgun at Titus's chest and demanded to know whose boy he was, his finger resting a hair too close to the trigger for comfort. It was only Cato's steady composure and the bill of sale he carried carefully folded inside his coat that convinced the men to let them pass at all, and even then the youngest of the 3 spat in the dirt near Titus's boots before finally waving them on. The encounter left Titus visibly shaken for the rest of the journey, a hard reminder that even a properly recorded sale offered him no true safety on an open road, and that his skin alone would remain, for any stranger with a badge or a gun, reason enough for suspicion. At Cypress Landing, after 2 days of asking at every trading post and tavern along the river, Titus and Cato finally found Cross. Older now, and visibly worn down by a trade that had never sat easy with him, his coat threadbare at the cuffs, and his hands trembling slightly as he counted out change for a customer at a supply counter. To their enormous relief, Cross not only remembered the transaction clearly, but still carried among his old papers the original receipt from the Carolina estate documenting the lawful sale. Without hesitation, he agreed to travel back with them to present it before Magistrate Vance. "In all my years moving people from one place to another for money," Cross admitted quietly to Titus during the ride back, "you're the first man I ever sold who came looking for me, not for revenge, but to ask for help. That says something about the kind of man you are. I couldn't rightly say the same about the kind of man I've been." Before the magistrate, Cross presented the original receipt and offered his sworn word confirming the legitimacy of the sale to Obese months before. Magistrate Vance examined the document carefully comparing the signature against others on file from that same Carolina county, and questioned Cross at some length about the exact circumstances of the original transaction before finally setting the paper down. With that document entered into the record, Magistrate Vance dismissed Tanner's claim outright, formally noting that the sale to Cross and the subsequent sale to Obese had both been entirely lawful. Tanner, furious but with no legal ground left to stand on, left the county empty-handed, muttering a final threat that men like me always find a way to collect what's rightfully owed. That warning would, in time, prove to have come not from Tanner directly, but to serve instead as fresh inspiration for Calloway, who upon hearing the whole affair understood that the legal road toward Odese's land was now closed to him for good, and that only violence remained. When Calloway learned of what had been done, his fury knew no bounds. He had badly underestimated the fat widow of Briar Hollow, and now he found himself without any clean legal path left to strip her of either her land or the protection Titus continued to offer her daily. He decided at last to fall back on what had always been his final card: outright, unhidden violence, dressed up conveniently as justice against a supposed cattle thief. Before that decisive night arrived, however, Calloway tried one last and perhaps most dangerous scheme of all. He called a public town meeting, inviting the leading citizens of Briar Hollow, Prudence Gantry among them, of course, to discuss openly the wisdom and safety of allowing a bondsman of known violent temperament to remain in this community. During that meeting, held beneath the wooden rafters of the county meeting house, Calloway hinted, without directly accusing him and so avoiding any legal responsibility, that Titus might well have been behind the recent cattle thefts reported on neighboring plantations, and that his continued presence represented a latent danger to the entire town. The meeting stretched on nearly 3 hours beneath those wooden rafters, lit by no more than a few tallow candles, casting long, uneasy shadows across the worried faces gathered there. Calloway, seated with the calculated calm of a man who already believes he knows the outcome, let others ask the harder questions, limiting himself to deeply regretting the possible threat posed to everyone's safety by a man of such violent and unknown history. The scheme very nearly worked. Several townsfolk, frightened and easily swayed, began eyeing Titus with renewed suspicion whenever they saw him walking the streets. It was Prudence Gantry, to many people's surprise, who spoke most forcefully against him that night. "And what if one night the cattle aren't enough for him anymore?" she asked, into the uneasy silence of the room. "Are we going to wait until he attacks some family in this town before we admit the danger we've let grow in our midst?" Her words found an echo in more than a few frightened faces, and for a moment it seemed the balance would tip decisively toward driving Titus out. A younger farmer near the back, a man named Cyrus Renner, who had lost 2 hogs earlier that season and had never fully accepted the explanation of the arrested drifters, stood and added his own doubts to Prudence's, insisting that a man raised on violence don't simply stop being violent because he's found himself a kind mistress. A murmur of agreement rippled through part of the room, and Calloway, still seated, allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction at how easily the doubt was spreading. Others nodded along, and for a long moment the meeting house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the room would finally break. It was then that old Jonas Pickett, still deeply grateful for the night Titus had defended his grain store, rose slowly to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "I was there that night," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "and I can tell you plainly that if Titus had wanted to do me harm, or rob me, or anything else, he had every chance in the world to do it without a soul ever knowing. Instead, he risked his own hide to save my crop, the crop of an old man he barely knew." The silence that followed his words was different from the one before, heavy now with a genuine doubt beginning to tilt the other way. Reverend Micah Holt had preached at the small Briar Hollow church for close to 20 years, arriving as a young circuit rider fresh out of seminary and never quite finding reason to move on. He had baptized half the town's children, buried most of its elders, and had, over the years, developed a habit of speaking his conscience plainly from the pulpit, even when it cost him the goodwill of his wealthier congregants. It was only through the determined intervention of Reverend Holt, who had personally witnessed Titus's steady and blameless conduct over recent months, that the proposal to run him out of Briar Hollow failed to carry that night. "I have counseled this man," the Reverend declared before the assembled meeting. With a moral authority few in the room dared to challenge outright, his gaze sweeping slowly across the gathered faces, as though daring anyone to interrupt him. "And I can say with full certainty that his heart does not hold the evil being laid at his feet here without a shred of proof. Take care, brothers, that we do not condemn a man not for what he has done, but for what we merely fear he might one day do." Calloway, seeing the meeting was not turning as he had hoped, left that night visibly furious, muttering under his breath to Mika that, "If this town won't see justice done on its own, then we'll have to see to it ourselves." Defeated in this first scheme, Calloway resolved at last to move to direct action. Mika, accompanied by 3 men armed to the teeth, arrived at Odese's property on a night of especially heavy storm. Brandishing the fabricated excuse that Titus had supposedly stolen cattle belonging to the neighboring plantation, an accusation entirely false, carefully invented to justify an attack, meant only to burn the humble house down and drive the widow off that coveted stretch of land beside the creek once and for all. It was in that exact moment, under the driving rain, soaking the packed dirt yard, that the dramatic scene with which this story began finally took place. Titus, standing his ground with everything he had to defend the woman who had given him back his dignity, faced down Calloway's armed men in the yard of that small frame house. The first man, a heavy-set hand Titus recognized as one of Mika's usual riders, charged forward through the driving rain swinging a blade high, clearly meaning to do serious harm, his boots slipping in the churned mud with every stride. Titus dodged the blow with a fluid motion, learned decades before in the fighting lessons of his childhood, seizing the man's wrist and twisting it hard until the weapon fell into the mud, before dropping him with a single solid blow to the chest that left him gasping on the sodden ground. The second man, more cautious after watching his companion fall, tried to circle around Titus's side in the near-total darkness, hoping the rain would cover his approach. But the years Titus had spent working iron by feel alone in dim forge light had sharpened senses the man could not have accounted for, and Titus anticipated the move a half-second before it came, answering with a sharp blow that dropped the second attacker just as swiftly beside the first, both men now groaning in the mud at his feet. It was then that Mika, seeing both his men defeated in a matter of moments, understood his plan was falling apart before his eyes. In one last desperate move, he drew a hidden knife from beneath his coat. Odessa, without a moment's hesitation, threw herself between the 2 men just as Mika tried to strike Titus from behind, catching a shallow cut across her arm that made her cry out in pain, but mercifully proved nothing worse than a scare. Odessa's desperate cry seemed to wake something deep and until then unknown in Titus. With a strength he himself had not known he still possessed, he wrestled Mika fully to the muddy ground, pinning him firmly until the neighbors, roused by the commotion, arrived at last with torches lit and blades drawn to bring the violent confrontation to its end. Old Jonas Pickett, grateful still for the grain store Titus had defended months before, was among the first to arrive, brandishing an old flintlock he barely knew how to fire, but waved with fierce determination as he shouted to rouse the nearest neighbors, his cane forgotten somewhere behind him in his hurry to reach the commotion. It was then that something no one expected happened. One of the captured men, a young field hand named Jesse, who had worked for Calloway only a few months and clearly did not share his superior's cruelty, began to tremble, his eyes darting between the torchlit faces surrounding him, and finally confessed before everyone present that Calloway himself had explicitly ordered the house burned that night, promising him and the other men extra pay if they left that stretch of land good and cleared. His voice cracked as he spoke, and more than one neighbor in the gathered crowd exchanged a knowing glance, as though they had long suspected as much, but never had proof enough to say so aloud. Mika and his men, thoroughly defeated and humiliated before the gathered crowd, were led without resistance before the county authorities, marched down the muddy road at first light, with their wrists bound and their heads down, while what remained of the crowd watched in a silence far more damning than any shouted judgment could have been. A formal hearing was held 2 weeks later, before Magistrate Ezekiel Vance, who, already familiar with Odessa and Titus's case, heard both Jesse's confession and the testimony of several neighbors who had witnessed the events of that stormy night firsthand. The hearing itself was held in the same wood-raftered meeting house where Calloway had once nearly turned the town against Titus, and more than a few in the gathered crowd seemed to note the irony without saying so aloud. Micah, seated at the hearing with his hands bound and his pride thoroughly broken, tried at first to claim that Titus had attacked him without cause while he was simply investigating a case of stolen cattle. But once Magistrate Vance produced Jesse's signed statement confirming that Calloway himself had ordered the fire set, the overseer fell silent, understanding at last that no version of events remained left to defend. This court has watched, these past months, a sustained and deliberate scheme to strip a widow of land she holds by lawful right, through deceit, through threat, and finally through outright violence, Magistrate Vance declared before the assembled room, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. I will not see the justice of this county turned into a tool for those with more land and more standing, to use against those with less of either. Micah was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor on the county road crew for assault and false testimony. Calloway, though he managed through his considerable influence to avoid any direct legal consequence himself, saw his standing in the county badly and permanently damaged, and he never again attempted to drive Odessa from her land beside the creek. Men who had once tipped their hats to him at the courthouse now offered only curt nods, and more than one contract he tried to arrange that year fell through for reasons no one troubled to explain to him directly. The months that followed brought a remarkable transformation, both for Odessa herself and for the town of Briar Hollow as a whole. The same community that had once whispered scornfully about the fool widow who bought herself a dangerous slave now spoke openly and with real respect of Odessa Pruitt and of Titus, the man who had defended his mistress at the risk of his own life. The same women who had once crossed the street to avoid her gradually began stopping by to visit, to ask her advice, to admire openly the quiet strength she had shown both in facing the town's cruelty and in standing against a powerful planter's direct threats. Some brought preserves or bolts of cloth as small, unspoken apologies for years of unkindness. Others simply lingered a little longer at her gate than politeness strictly required, as though hoping proximity alone might earn them some small share in the respect she had so plainly won. Even Prudence Gantry, once her fiercest detractor, eventually appeared at her door with a basket of preserves as a kind of silent apology, muttering something about having judged too harshly a woman braver than most folks in this town. Odessa, holding no grudge, invited her in for coffee, a small act of grace that helped settle her new standing firmly within the Briar Hollow community. Titus never stopped his quiet visits to Cato Freeman's settlement over the years that followed, keeping alive the bond with the community of free men and women who had helped him in the hardest days of that first winter with Odessa. In time, he became something of a mentor himself to other formerly enslaved men who passed through the region seeking any small foothold of security, teaching them patiently the same careful path Cato had once shown him, how to secure a properly witnessed bill of sale, which magistrates in the county could be trusted to deal fairly, and which men, like Calloway, could not. Titus, over time, saved what small earnings he could from mending tools for half the county, and used them to add a proper chimney and a second bellows to his forge, becoming known throughout Briar Hollow as the surest hand with iron for miles around. One such man, a young field hand freed by his own dying owner's will a few counties over, spent the better part of a season working alongside Titus at the forge, learning the trade with the same hunger Titus himself had once shown his own father as a boy. Every man ought to leave this world knowing one thing well enough to teach it to somebody else, Titus told him one evening, watching the younger man hammer out his first crooked but serviceable hinge. That's about the only kind of inheritance most of us are ever likely to get to pass down. The same neighbors who had once crossed the road to avoid him now lined up on Saturday mornings to have their plow blades sharpened and their wagon hinges repaired. Who'd have thought, old Jonas Pickett liked to say in the years that followed, leaning on his cane in the courthouse square, that the man this whole town once feared without knowing him would end up teaching half of us a trade our own fathers never bothered to pass down. Titus, hearing such talk, would only offer a quiet, humble smile, remembering privately that the same patience he now showed his neighbors was the very patience Odessa had once shown him in the hardest days of that first winter. Odessa and Titus continued working the land together in the years that followed, the small parcel by the creek slowly becoming, under their combined labor, one of the more productive plots in the county, known for the quality of its cotton and for the quiet generosity with which the widow shared part of each harvest with the poorest families in town during the leanest years. The garden Odessa had once struggled to keep alive on her own grew each season under Titus's steady care, until visitors passing along the road remarked that the widow's place looked more prosperous than plots twice its size. Come each autumn, when the picking season ended and the county gathered for the small harvest fair held on the courthouse green, it became a familiar sight to see Titus's ironwork displayed proudly beside Odessa's preserves and quilts, the two of them standing together at their modest table, while neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them now stopped to admire what their hands had built. It was not, and could never be under the laws of that place and time, a marriage in the eyes of the law, nor freedom in any form the courts would recognize. What it was, instead, was something the law had never accounted for and could not fully touch, a devotion built day by day out of shared labor, shared danger, and a loyalty that had already been tested once by fire and rain and had not broken. Not everything, however, remained simple in the years of relative peace that followed. When word of Odessa's steadily improving harvest reached a distant cousin of her late husband, a man named Otis Pruitt, who had shown no interest whatsoever in the widow's welfare during her hardest months, he arrived unannounced one spring, dust still thick on his traveling clothes, claiming some vague family right to a share of the land, insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that a widow with no children of her own blood had no proper claim to keep land meant for family. Odessa, wounded but unsurprised by the sudden greed of a man who had never once checked on her before, once again sought out Magistrate Vance, who confirmed plainly that the land had come down through Odessa's own family long before her marriage to Elias, leaving Otis no legal standing whatsoever. He left town grumbling, muttering ungracious remarks about the widow and her slave living high off land that should have stayed in the family. Titus, hearing of the encounter later that evening while mending a fence, only shook his head calmly. "We've weathered worse than one bitter man arriving late to pretend he cared," he told her, taking her hand. "Let him talk. We'll keep building what we've built with our own two hands." Odessa, in the quiet years that followed, would sometimes tell whichever neighbor happened to be sitting with her on the porch of an evening that those $13 had been, without question, the wisest thing she had ever done with money in her whole life. Not because she had bought a man, she always insisted firmly, but because that afternoon she had chosen, for the first time in her existence, to look past everything the world had told her to fear, and had found instead someone who gave her back, many times over, all the dignity years of scorn had tried to take from her. With the passing years, Briar Hollow itself changed, quietly and unevenly, in how it received strangers passing through. When other modest families in the county heard the story of Odessa and Titus, some of them began extending a little more welcome to newly freed men and women who occasionally came through looking for honest work, remembering the example of the widow who had risked her last $13 and ended up gaining, from it, far more than she ever could have imagined. Before we close this story, it is worth sharing one final verifiable piece of history connected to what we have just told. Formal manumission, the legal freeing of an enslaved person by an owner, grew increasingly rare and difficult across the Deep South in the decades before the Civil War, as state legislatures tightened restrictions in response to growing anxieties about free black populations. By the 1850s, Mississippi required legislative approval for most acts of manumission and generally compelled freed individuals to leave the state within a set period, effectively separating them from any family, land, or community they had built. Recorded bills of sale, of the kind Odessa and Titus secured before Magistrate Vance, were a genuine and commonly used legal instrument throughout the antebellum South, though their purpose was almost always to formalize ownership rather than to offer protection. to the enslaved person named within them. This left informal arrangements, private loyalty, community reputation, and, in some documented cases, the quiet protection of sympathetic owners, as some of the only tools available to enslaved people seeking any measure of security within an otherwise merciless legal system. Historical records also confirm that widows across the antebellum South, particularly those without adult sons or male relatives, faced considerable difficulty defending their property against wealthier neighbors, and not infrequently relied on the very people they held in bondage for both physical protection and the labor needed to keep a small farm solvent, a bitter irony embedded at the very heart of the system itself. Legal disputes over slave sales, much like the confrontation between Odessa and Rufus Tanner in this story, were in fact fairly common in county courts of the period, as the interstate slave trade frequently produced disputed claims, forged papers, and competing assertions of ownership that magistrates were regularly called upon to untangle. Free communities of color, like the fictional settlement led by Cato Freeman in this story, did exist throughout the antebellum South in various forms, though always under close legal scrutiny and constant threat of expulsion or re-enslavement. These documented realities, the near impossibility of formal freedom, the precarious position of poorer white landowners, and the fragile, often invisible networks of free black communities, sit at the very center of the story of Odessa and Titus. Odessa Pruitt, the widow who spent her last $13 on a man no other buyer in that square would take, found in that desperate decision not legal freedom for either of them, nor any protection the law would fully recognize, but something the system had never intended to allow and could not entirely stamp out. A devotion that held through fire, through slander, through violence, and through every year that followed on that narrow strip of land beside the creek. She often thought, in her quieter moments by the fire, that the world had spent her whole life trying to convince her she was worth little, and that the one decision everyone had mocked as foolish had turned out to be the truest measure of her worth she would ever be given the chance to prove. And Titus, the man who arrived in Briar Hollow bound in chains on a market afternoon, found at last what he had searched for since the day he was first torn from everything he had ever known, not the freedom the law withheld from him, but a place, however incomplete, however unjust the world around it remained, where he was finally seen, and where someone had once been willing to stand between him and the dark.